Lucasta says, I know what you mean. Then the flowers would fade, and the music would stop, and the walls would be broken, and you would find yourself in a devastated area, a bomb site, willow herb, a dirty public square, but I can't imagine that happening to you. You seem so secure to me, not only in your music, that's just its expression. You don't seem to me to need anybody. Colby says, that's quite untrue. Lucasta says, but you've something else that I haven't got, something of which the music is a symbol. I really would like to understand music, not in order to be able to talk about it, but partly to enjoy it, and because of what it stands for. You know, I'm a little jealous of your music, and I see it as a means of contact with the world, more real than any I've ever lived in, and I'd like to understand you. Back in the day, the standard of music and being considered a musician was much higher than it is today. At least amongst professionals. Colby says, I believe you do already, better than other people. I want to understand you. Does anyone ever come to understand anyone? Lucasta says, I think you're being very discouraging. Are you doing it deliberately? Colby says, that's not what I meant. I meant there's no end to understanding a person. All one can do is to understand them better and to keep up with them, so that as the other changes, you can understand the change as soon as it happens, though you couldn't have predicted it. Lucasta says, I think I'm changing. I've changed quite a bit in the last 2 hours, Colby says, and I think I'm changing too, but perhaps what we call change. Lucasta says, it's understanding better what one really is, and the reason why that comes about, perhaps, Colby says, is beginning to understand another person. Lucasta says, oh, Colby, now that we begin to understand, I'd like you to know a little more about me. You must have wondered, Colby says. Must have wondered. No, I haven't wondered. It's all a strange world, to me, you know, in which I find myself. But if you mean wondered about your background, no, I've been curious to know what you are, not who you are in the ordinary sense. Is that what you mean? I've just accepted you. Lucasta says, oh, that's so wonderful to be accepted. No one has just ever accepted me before. Ever just accepted me before. Of course, the facts don't matter, in a sense. But now we've got to this point, you might as well know them, Colby says. I'd gladly tell you everything about myself, but you know most of what there is to say already, either from what I've told you or from what I've told B or from Sir Claude. Lucasta says, Claude hasn't told me much anything about you. He doesn't tell me much. As for B, I'd much rather hear it from yourself, Colby says. There's only one thing I can't tell you, at least not yet. I'm not allowed to tell. That's about my parents. Lucasta says, oh, I see. Well, I can't believe that matters, but I can tell you all about my parents. At least I'm going to. Colby says, does that matter either? Lucasta says, in one way it matters. A little while ago, you said very cleverly that when we first met, you saw I was trying to give a false impression. I want to tell you now why I tried to do that. And it's always succeeded with people before. I got in the habit of giving that impression. That's where B has been such a help to me. He fosters the impression. He half believes in it. But he knows all about me. And he knows what some men have thought about me wasn't true. Colby says, what wasn't true? Lucasta says, that I was Claude's mistress, or had been his mistress, palmed off on B. Colby says, I never thought of such a thing. Lucasta says, you never thought of such a thing? There are not many men who wouldn't have thought it. I don't know about B. He's very generous. I don't think he'd have minded. But he's very clever too, and he guessed the truth from the very first moment, Colby says. But what is there to know? Lucasta says, you'll laugh when I tell you. I'm only Claude's daughter. Colby says, his daughter? Lucasta says, his daughter? Oh, it's a sordid story. I hated my mother. I never could see how Claude had ever liked her. Oh, that childhood. Always living in seedy lodgings and being turned out when the neighbors complained. Oh, of course, Claude gave her money, a regular allowance, but it wouldn't have mattered how much he'd given her. It was always spent before the end of the quarter, on gin and betting, I should guess. And I knew how she supplemented her income when I was sent out. I'd been locked in a cupboard. I was only 8 years old when she died of an accidental overdose. Then Claude took me over. That was lucky. But I was old enough to remember too much. Colby says, you're Claude's daughter? Lucasta says, oh, there's no doubt of that. I'm sure he wished there had been. He's been good to me, in his way. But I'm always a reminder to him of something he would prefer to regret. But why don't you say something? Are you shocked? Colby says, shocked? No, yes. You don't understand. I want to explain, but I can't. Just yet. Why did I ever come into this house? Lucasta says, I can see well enough you are shocked. You ought to see your face. I'm disappointed. I suppose that's all. I believe you're more shocked than if I'd told you I was Claude's mistress. Claude has always been ashamed of me. Now you're ashamed of me. I thought you'd understand. Little you know what it's like to be a bastard and wanted by nobody. I know why you're shocked. Claude has just accepted me like a debit item, always in his cash account. I don't like myself. I don't like the person I forced myself to be. And I liked you because you didn't like that person either. I thought you'd come to see me as the real kind of person that I want to be, that I know I am. That was new to me. I suppose I was flattered. And I thought now, perhaps, if someone else sees me as I really am, I might become myself. Colby says, oh, Lucasta, I'm not shocked. Not by you, not by anything you think. It's to do with myself, Lucasta says. Yourself indeed, your precious self. Why don't you shut yourself up in that garden, where you like to be alone with yourself? Or perhaps you think it would be bad for your prospects. Now that you're Claude's white-headed boy, perhaps he'll adopt you and make you his heir, and you'll marry another Lady Elizabeth. But in that event, Colby, you have to accept me as your sister, even if I am a gutter snipe. And people should regret their acts, but not necessarily everything that comes from it. And if the parents made a mistake, the parents made a mistake. It's not the, don't lay it on the kids. Colby says, you mustn't use such words. You don't know how it's hurting. Lucasta says, I could use words much stronger than that. And I will if I choose. Oh, I'm sorry. I suppose it's my mother coming out of me. You know, Colby, I'm truly disappointed. I was sure when I told you all I did that you wouldn't mind at all, that you might be sorry for me. But now I don't want you to be sorry, thank you. Why, I'd actually thought of telling you before, and I postponed telling you, just for the fun of it. I thought, When I tell him, it will be so wonderful, all in a moment, and now there's nothing. Nothing at all. It's far worse than ever. Just when you think you're on the point of release from loneliness, then loneliness swoops down upon you. When you think you're getting out, you're getting further in. And you know, at last, but there's no escape. Well, I'll be going, Colby says. You mustn't go yet. There's something else that I want to explain, and now I'm going to. I'm breaking a promise. But, Lucasta says, I don't believe there's anything to explain that could explain anything away. I shall never forget that look on your face when I told you about Claude and my mother. I may be a bastard, but I have some self-respect. Well, there's always B. I think that now I'm just beginning to appreciate B. Lucasta says, wait. Colby says, Lucasta, wait. And B. Kagan enters and says, Enter B. Kagan to see the new flat. And here's Lucasta. I knew I should find she got in first. Trust Kagan's intuitions. I'm your guardian angel, Colby, to protect you from Lucasta. Lucasta says, You're my guardian angel? At the moment, B, you're to take me out to dinner, and I'm dying for a drink. Kagan says, I told Colby I never learned to mix cocktails. If you don't want women always dropping in on you, and between a couple of man-eating tigers, like you and Lizzie, he's got to have protection, Lucasta says. Colby doesn't need your protection, Racket. So far as I'm concerned, B, and as for Lizzie, you better not get in her way when she's hunting. But all that matters now, that I'm hungry, and you've got to give me a very good dinner. Kagan says, you shall be fed, all in good time. I've come to inspect the new bachelor quarters, and to wish Colby luck. I've always been lucky, and I always bring luck to other people. Colby says, will you have a glass of sherry? Kagan says, yes, I'll have a glass of sherry. To drink, success to the flat. Lucasta, too. Much better for you than cocktails, Lucasta. Lucasta says, you know I don't like sherry. Kagan says, you've got to drink it, to Colby. And a happy bachelor life, which depends, of course, on preventing Lizzie from always interfering. Be firm with her, Colby. Assert your right to a little privacy. Now's the moment for firmness. Don't let her cross the threshold. Lucasta says, as if you weren't as afraid of her as anybody. Kagan says, well, at least I've always managed to escape her. Lucasta says, only because she's never wanted to pursue you. Kagan says, yes, I made a bad impression at the start. I saw that it was necessary, I'm afraid. Colby has made a good impression, which you'll have to live down. I must say, I like the way you've had the place done up. Colby says, it was Lady Elizabeth chose the decoration. Kagan says, then I'm not sure I like them. You must change the colors. It's a bit too dim. You need something brighter. But otherwise, it looks perfect. It looks pretty comfortable. If I was as snug as Colby is, Lucasta, I'd never have thought of changing my condition. Lucasta says, you're always free to think again. And it doesn't matter who or what the source is. If you like it, you like it. If it's truth, it's truth. If it's good, it's good. This, it's from them over there, that sort of thing. Kagan says, marriage is a gamble, but I'm a born gambler. And I put my shirt, no, not quite the right expression. Lucasta is the most exciting speculation I've ever thought of investing in. Colby's more cautious, Colby. You and I ought to be in business together. I'm a good guesser, but I sometimes guess wrong. Make decisions on the spur of a moment. But you'd never take a leap in the dark. You'd keep me on the rails. Colby says, that's just nonsense. You only pretend that you're a gambler, and you've got as level a head as anyone. And you never get involved in anything risky. You like to pretend to other people that you're a gambler. I don't believe you ever gamble on anything that isn't a certainty. Kagan says, well, there's something in that. You know, Lucasta. Colby is a good judge of character. Lucasta says, you'd need to be a better judge of character yourself before you said that of Colby. Kagan says, oh, I'm a good judge. Now I'll tell you the difference between ourselves and Colby, you and me. The one thing we want is security and respectability. Now, Colby doesn't really care about being respectable. He was born and bred to it. I wasn't Colby. Do you know? I was a foundling. You didn't know that. Never had any parents. Just adopted from nowhere. That's why I want to be power in the city. On the boards of all the solidest companies. Because I've no background. No background at all. That's one thing I like about Lucasta. She doesn't despise me. Lucasta says, nobody could despise you. And what's more important, you don't despise me. Kagan says, nobody could despise you, Lucasta. And we want the same thing. But as for Colby, he's the sort of fellow who might chuck it all and go to live on a desert island. But I hope you won't do that. We need you where you are. Colby says, I'm beginning to believe you're a pretty shrewd insight into things that have nothing to do with business. Kagan says, and you have a very sound head for business. Maybe you're a better financier than I am. That's why we ought to be in business together. Lucasta says, you're both very good at paying compliments, but I remarked that I was hungry. Kagan says, you can't want dinner yet. It's only 6 o'clock. We can't dine until 8. Not at any restaurant that you like. For a change, let's talk about Lucasta. Lucasta rises. And says, if you want to discuss me, there's a knock at the door, and Lady Elizabeth answers and says, oh, good evening, Mr. Kagan. Good evening, Lucasta. Have you just arrived, or are you just leaving? Lucasta says, we're on the point of leaving, Lady Elizabeth. Lady Elizabeth says, I've come over to have a look at the flat. Now that you've moved in, because you can't tell whether a scheme of decoration is right until the place has been lived in by the person for whom it was designed. So I have to see you in it. Did you say you were leaving? Kagan says, we're going out to dinner. Lucasta is very hungry. Lady Elizabeth says, hungry at 6 o'clock? Where will you get dinner? Oh, I know. It's a chance to try that herbal restaurant. I recommend to you. You can have dinner early. Most of its patrons dine at 6:30, and they have the most delicious salads. And I told you, Mr. Kagan, you're the type of person who needs to eat a great deal of salad. You remember, I made you take a note of the address, and I don't believe that you've been there yet. Kagan says, why no, as a matter of fact, I haven't. I've kept meaning to. Shall we go there, Lucasta? Lucasta says, I'm so hungry. I can even eat an herbal salad. Lady Elizabeth says, that's right, just mention my name, Mr. Kagan, and ask for the table in the left-hand corner. And it's the best waitress. Good night. Lucasta says, good night. Kagan says, and thank you very much. You give such good advice. Kagan and Lucasta exit. Lady Elizabeth says, were those young people here by appointment, or did they come in unexpectedly? Colby says, I'd invited Lucasta. She'd asked me to play to her. Lady Elizabeth says, you call her Lucasta? Young people nowadays seem to have dropped the use of surnames altogether. But, Colby, I hope you won't mind a gentle hint. I feared it was possible you might become too friendly with Mr. Kagan and Miss Angel. I can see you've lived a rather sheltered life, and I've noticed them paying you a good deal of attention. You see, you're rather a curiosity to both of them. You're not the sort of person they ever meet in their kind of society, so naturally, they want to take you up. I can speak more freely as an elderly person, Colby says, but Lady Elizabeth says, well, older than you are, and a good deal wiser in the ways of the world. Well, people like to presume that just because they're old, but some people get less wise as it gets older. Even if their mind's not slipping, they've, developed ways that they've got away with, which is not necessarily the same thing as wise. Colby says, but Lady Elizabeth, what is it you object to? They're both intelligent and kind. Lady Elizabeth says, oh, I don't say they're not intelligent and kind. I'm not making any malicious suggestions, but they are rather worldly and materialistic, and, well, rather vulgar. They're not your sort at all. Colby says, I shouldn't call them vulgar. Perhaps I'm vulgar too. But what do you think is my sort? I don't know myself, and I should like to know. Lady Elizabeth says, in the first place, you ought to mix with people of breeding. I said to myself, when I first saw you, he's very well bred. I knew nothing about you, but one doesn't need to know if one knows what breeding is. And second, you need intellectual society. Now that already limits your acquaintance, because what's surprising, well-bred people are sometimes far from intellectual, or at least using their intellect properly. And what's less surprising, intellectual people are often ill-bred, but that's not all. You need intellectual, well-bred people of spirituality, and that's the rarest. Colby says, that would limit my acquaintance to a very small number, and I don't know where to find them. Lady Elizabeth says, they can be found, but I came to have a look at the flat, to see if the color scheme really suited you. I believe it does, the walls and the curtains, and most of the furniture. But that writing table, where did that writing table come from? Rumbly and tumbly. Colby says, it's an office desk. Sir Claude got it for me. I said I needed a desk in my room. You see, I shall do a good deal of work here. Lady Elizabeth says, and what is that shrouded object in it? Don't tell me it's a typewriter. Colby says, it's a typewriter. I've already begun to work here. At the moment, I'm working on a company report. Lady Elizabeth says, I hadn't reckoned on reports and typewriters when I designed this room. Colby says, it's the sort of room I wanted. Lady Elizabeth rises and says, I see a photograph in a silver frame. I'm afraid I shall have to instruct you, Colby. Photographic portraits, even in silver frames, are much too intimate for the sitting room. May I remove it? Surely your bedroom is the proper place for photographic souvenirs. She sits down, holding the portrait. What was I going to say? Oh, I know. You do believe in reincarnation? Colby says, no, I don't. I mean, I've never thought about it. Lady Elizabeth says, I can't say that I believe in it. I did for a time. I studied the doctrine. But I was going to say, if I believed in it, I should have said that we had known each other in some previous incarnation. Is this your mother? Colby says, no. That is my aunt. I never knew my mother. She died when I was born. And has reincarnation ever been needed to explain anything? Lady Elizabeth says, she died when you were born. Have you other near relatives? Brothers or sisters? Colby says, no brothers or sisters. No. As for other relatives, I never know why. I never knew any when I was a child. I suppose I've never been interested in relatives. Lady Elizabeth says, You did not want to know your relatives? I understand exactly how you felt. How I disliked my parents. I had a governess, several in fact, and I loathed them all. Were you brought up by a governess? Colby says, no, by my aunt. Lady Elizabeth says, and did you loathe her? No, of course not. Or you wouldn't have her portrait if you never knew your parents. But was your father living? Colby says, I never knew my father. Lady Elizabeth says, then if you never had a governess, and if you never knew either of your parents, you can't understand what loathing really is. Yet, we must have some similarity of background. Colby says, but you had parents, and no doubt many relatives. Lady Elizabeth says, oh, swarms of relatives, and such unpleasant people. I thought to myself, as a dove in an eagle's nest, they were so carnivorous, always killing things and eating them. Yet our childhood must have been similar. These are only superficial differences. You must have been a lonely child, having no relatives, no brothers or sisters, and I was lonely because they were so numerous and so uncongenial. They made me feel an outcast, and yet they were so commonplace. Do you know, Colby, when I was a child? Getting rumbly and the tumbly here. Stomach's definitely empty, though. I had 3 obsessions, and I never told anyone. I wonder if you had the same obsessions. Colby says, what were they? Lady Elizabeth says, the first was that I was very ugly, and I didn't know it. Then, that I was feeble-minded, and I didn't know it. Finally, that I was a foundling, and didn't know it. Of course, I was terrified of being ugly, and of being feeble-minded, though my family made me think so. But you know, I actually liked to believe that I was a foundling. Or do I mean changeling? Colby says, I don't know what you mean. Lady Elizabeth says, however that may be, I didn't want to belong there. I refused to believe that my father could have been an ordinary earl, and I couldn't believe that my mother was my mother. These were foolish fancies. I was a silly girl, and very romantic, but it goes to show how different I felt myself to be. And then I took up the wisdom of the East, and believed for a while in reincarnation, which is not the only option in any country, really, but people thought, oh, well, in India, they were so, that seemed to explain it all. I don't believe it now. That was only a phase. But it made it all so simple, to be able to think that one's earthly parents are only the means that we have to employ to become reincarnate, and that one's real ancestry is one's previous existences. Of course, there's something in us, in all of us, which isn't just heredity, but something unique, something that we have been from eternity, something straight from God. That means that we are nearer to God than to anyone. Where did you live as a child? Nearer to God than anyone? I can accept that in a way if God's omnipresent. Colby says, in Teddington. Lady Elizabeth says, Teddington? In what country? Colby says, it's very close to London.